Hey everyone, it's Samuel, and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, the role of food. In the Wilds, the intellect devourer. And in the Tavern, what would you do if food was poisoned? Well, hey everybody! I hope everyone out there is having an excellent day. Glad to have you back in for another episode of Plot Hooks. Excited to talk about the role that food can play in our TTRPG stories. Before we get into the Prime Material though, just some announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. We're at Plot Hooks on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel if you'd like to listen to the podcast that way. Remember our Quest for 1K that's going on Twitter. We still have that giveaway that's standing right now. We're about 100 followers away from giving away that awesome package of dice from Greenleaf Geek, a dice tray from Games by B, and the spell tracker from Arcane Spectacles. Also remember, however you listen to the podcast, if you would give the podcast a rating, if the avenue of which you listen to the show gives that option. We genuinely appreciate each and every one of you that listen. And if you feel that it's worth it, it would be awesome of you to go the extra mile and support us on Patreon. There's lots of awesome perks up there for our patrons. We try to make it really worth your while, including lots of homebrew information, but also just tons of content related to Plot Hooks adventures, including being able to get all the episodes of that show in one big chunk instead of waiting for all the parts that come out on the podcast feed. But with that out of the way, let's dive into our main topic today, the role of food. Mealtime is one of those things that's often skipped in Dungeons & Dragons and other role-playing games as well. We often just gloss over it. It's something that we understand has to happen. That's how life functions. But why would we focus on the eating of food, on the going to restaurants, on those type of things when we could be out slaying beholders and dragons? Food is an afterthought, almost as much as something like the need to go to the restroom in role-playing games. It's seen generally as an element that will drag down the story, not enhance it. And in fairness, those type of elements that drag down things do exist in role-playing games. The restroom, while that's a joke that people often throw around, that does provide a great example of this. It's not generally going to add a ton to the experience. Mostly it will just take away from whatever story you're trying to tell. There are certainly moments where it could be relevant or humorous, but oftentimes it just takes away. But my argument today is that food is not one of those elements. It's not one of those things that drags down a story. In reality, it actually can be a resource that can be pulled on in order to create great moments and great environments. It doesn't have to be done all the time, or else it really could bog down the story, but it is an excellent tool in the arsenal of any role player or GM. And so today we're going to look at 5 things that food can do, that food can bring to a particular narrative in order to help us tell great stories. First, food can really fill out an environment. Food is a very sensory thing. It plays into so many different spaces. the aroma of cooking food, of searing meats around the fire, of sizzling vegetables in the pan. The visual appeal of the most finely crafted dish, or even the simplest spit roasting over a fire, the heat or chill coming off of the food, the tactile feel of the food in your hands, or the fork, the utensils, or the feeling as you chew, the taste and the texture, the multiplicity of flavors, the sound of a crackling fire or sizzling meat or boiling water. All of those are extremely sensory things. And there's such a large sensory aspect to any meal, or even just having food in the environment of a scene. Food really can fill out an environment. And this fact means that it can aid with immersion. Adding in descriptions of the meal that the players are eating, or even the food that surrounds them while a scene is occurring, even if they aren't the ones eating it, it gives so many sensory signals that can help players really imagine the scene. It's our senses that really help us connect anyway. And as DMs and GMs, typically we communicate scenes primarily in what we see. We give environments with visual information. But food gives an avenue that breaches all kinds of different sensory inputs that hit us all at once. And again, that really helps fill out an environment. It doesn't have to be a major part of the role play or necessarily even part of it at all, but it fills out the role play environment. It helps give the players a greater sense of where their character is at, as well as giving them lots of potential interaction points. Just having food in the background of a scene gives them the opportunity to walk over to the buffet table as they talk to the ambassador, so to speak. Now they have this interaction point that they can actually pull into the scene if they so choose. This doesn't have to happen all the time. I mean, not everywhere that the players are going to go is going to have cooking or cooked food. But having these sorts of things can really help fill out an environment and thus help the players roleplay. Secondly, food adds to a culture. And we know this from real life, right? Food is a big part of any distinctive culture. Each culture has their own cuisine, their own method of preparing things, their own spices, which are common. And whenever a party is in, especially a new location, they need vivid descriptions to give them a sense of the culture around them. And we do this in lots of different ways, but food can do this really well. When entering a new place, the differences in that local cuisine really flavors, pun completely intended, the local environment. All those sensory elements we've already mentioned, using them in this manner can really be powerful. Just think of the differences. In one scenario, your party comes upon a civilization, let's say it's based off of Indian influences, and you describe the architecture, how the buildings are built according to Vastu Shastra-inspired systems. You describe the flowing, often colorful garb, and the prevalence of beautiful jewelry, including filigree-style jewelry. You describe the vibrance of the people and the types of interactions that the players see as they walk through the streets. And in this scenario, you've given an amazing description. You've really brought the players into this environment. It's a great introduction to the culture that the players are about to interact with. But all of that, as awesome as that is as an initial description, is just two senses. It's sight and hearing. You're seeing all these things and hearing the interactions of the people. But instead, think of a second scenario where you take the extra step of adding food. And as soon as food is introduced to that equation, you add a plethora of other senses. Again, just like with the first thing that we discussed, it fills out an environment. And here you're doing that in a method to add to the culture. The smells of cooking food, the various delicacies that are unique to the region, the unique spices. What a blend the Indian-based society would have in this case. The cardamom, the clove, the cassia bark, cumin, coriander. There's so many different things that you get to add to a scenario which help build out the culture and distinguish it as different. Sometimes that's hard, right? Because it's hard sometimes to not just create various fantasy towns 1, 2, and 3, and there's not that much that actually differentiates them. But when you're actually trying to create a very unique culture or base a culture off of something that is real world, a food is an awesome way to actually distinguish that. And whether it's something that the party interacts with as they walk through the streets of a new location, or a unique dish that they eat at the tavern, whatever it is, food can add to a culture. Thirdly, food can have magical effects. This is something that I think is not very well explored in Dungeons & Dragons. Everything is a potion. There's not a lot of food that actually has magical properties. You have spells that allow you to eat something like Hero's Feast, where you get a chance to eat this wonderful meal and you get these benefits from it, but there's not really much magical food that you eat and then get a certain effect. And that is a massive untapped space, in my opinion, within official material. I'd highly recommend Canarl's Candy Compendium, a DM's Guild release which was written by Mackenzie de Armas, who actually appeared on this show several episodes back. That's just filled with all kinds of candies which have unique magical effects. And I think that's just such a flavorful thing. It's much more unique to actually be eating something and gaining an ability than just drinking from a glass vial. It's the difference in vibrance between eating a delicious steak or drinking a protein shake. They may have the exact same nutritional value, but one is, at least to me, much more appealing and appetizing. And you don't even necessarily have to come up with anything new mechanically. I think it'd be great to do that. There's lots of awesome space you can play with. But you could just take a potion out of the Dungeon Master's Guide and just say, okay, this isn't actually a potion. This is a berry that you eat. And whenever you eat this berry, you get this effect. That could be really cool. And it opens up a whole new realm of ways to use food in your adventures. Is there somebody who's a wizard that actually makes this food if it's a prepared thing? And maybe the party has to go collect more, or maybe this person is very sought after because they can cook these magical foods. What if it's a harvested thing, like that berry that I just mentioned? Then the party could be sent on quests to actually go find a collection of these particular berries or flowers or whatever have you. I think it's a great way to use food in a unique way that isn't often done, at least not in Dungeons & Dragons. Fourthly, food can be a scarce resource. And we talked a little bit about this back in the roundtable episode whenever we talked about travel and how to handle that in our TTRPG games. If you're looking for a more gritty environment or trying to really wear down on the resources of the players, food, especially at lower levels, is an important part of that. There's a reason your background gives you a certain amount of rations at the start of any campaign. You need that food to survive. And in that case, rather than focusing much on the food itself and the act of eating it or smelling it or sensing it, food becomes a mechanical resource, and your party has to, as they delve through a dungeon which is longer than they thought, or as they're lost in the wilderness trying to get back out, they're having to ration this food and maybe decide between eating or taking exhaustion levels, or they have to figure out how they're going to handle this constrained resource. Now, in Dungeons and Dragons, pretty quickly you end up with spells like create food and water, and that just becomes a little bit harder to do. But there are still ways that you can creatively constrain the nutritional resources of a party. Again, this is another way that you can take food and turn it into something that doesn't bog down the narrative, that doesn't have to just be ignored. It turns into something which is an actual story point. So we've got that food can fill out an environment, food adds to a culture, food can have magical effects, and food can be a scarce resource. Fifthly and finally, food can just provide a necessary pause. Sometimes players want to go too fast. I know I do. I want to get from one story point to the next because I'm really excited to figure out what's going to happen. Oh, this thing that's just been revealed. I want to get to the next city so I can find out what that actually means. But sometimes just running so quickly back and forth between so many different things and never actually taking time to roleplay a pause, we can miss out on lots of brilliant intra-party roleplay opportunities. How did the other characters feel about what just happened? How are the characters growing? How are they changing? How is this whole party thing going? How do they feel? It's helpful for us to take the time to actually have those pauses and conversations. And food can be a great way of actually doing that. And sometimes it's necessary even for ourselves to take that pause, because sometimes not only do we miss out on interacting with our party mates, but we sometimes forget to even pause long enough to get inside of our characters' own heads because we're so excited about what comes next that we can forget to think about exactly what is going on in my character's head about all these events that have just happened. And a meal can just provide a necessary pause. Having the party traveling and coming across another campsite with somebody else that invites them over to talk. And then that NPC can just sit there as they're all resting together for the evening, and the NPC can be a catalyst for conversation. And maybe can also share some cool tidbits of information about the plot along the way. By incorporating a meal in different ways like that the party then sits down and has, food can provide that necessary pause for reflection on the adventures. So those are just 5 short things, and I'm sure there's more. I really do enjoy food in role-playing games. And again, I don't think it's one of those elements that drags down a story. I think it's actually a really valuable resource, a really valuable tool that can be pulled out of the tool belt to create great moments and great environments and great storytelling. So how have you used food in your games? Are there other ways that you've found it could be useful? Do you disagree and think that it's just a drag down? We want to hear from you. Hit us up on social media. But I think for now, it's about time to, unfortunately, leave this delectable spread that we have in front of us and head out to the wilds and look at something quite creepy. We're out here in the wilderness. Today, the intellect devourer. Staying on the theme of food, we want to look at a creature that's known for its eating, And I asked our followers on Twitter for suggestions on this topic, and we got some great ones. But some of the ones that also fit really well, like the gelatinous cube, we've already done in previous episodes. The intellect devourer was suggested by @RogueNonGrata on Twitter, and it is a great monster. And quite possibly the scariest D&D monster at a low CR. And it's scary in all ways. How it looks, what it's associated with, and with what it does. It's scary with how it looks because the intellect devourer just looks like a brain that has ferocious clawed legs about the size of a dog just running at you. Can you imagine that thing just sprinting after you? And with a speed of 40 feet, unless you're a monk or something with high speed, it's running faster than you too. This dog-sized brain with ferocious huge legs. It's scary with what it's associated with because these are created and bred by the mind flayers as their servants. The mind flayers take a captive or a servant and subject their brain to a terrible ritual, creating this awful aberration. But even scarier than that, the most scary thing about it to me is what it can do. It's not very strong. It's got an AC of 12 with 21 hit points, rounding out at a CR2, but its abilities are terrifying. First off, it knows when you're close. It has the ability to detect sentience, where it can sense the presence and location of any creature with an intelligence greater than 2 within 300 feet. So unless you've cast Mind Blank on yourself or something like that, it knows if you're close. As for its actions, every action it makes an attack with its claws, which is just a simple plus 40 hit, 2d4 plus 2 slashing damage if it hits, but it also gets to make a devour intellect attack every single turn. And whenever that happens, the target has to succeed on a DC 12 intelligence saving throw. If it fails, it takes some psychic damage, but more importantly, the DM rolls 3d6 on a failure. And if that 3d6 is equal to or higher than the target's intelligence score, then the target's intelligence score is reduced to 0, and they are stunned and incapacitated until at least 1 point of intelligence is regained. They essentially just fall catatonic on the ground. And 3d6 is not that much, especially considering that intelligence is generally one of the lower stats for most players. Yeah, you try to make it somewhere along the average, but it's not going to be your highest or second highest stat unless you happen to be a wizard or an artificer or perhaps a rogue to help with your investigation checks. But it's generally going to be something like a 12 or so as far as your score. The average roll of 3d6 is 10.5. That means that if you've got an intelligence of 10, over half the time, you're going to be falling into a stupid stupor after being hit by one of these things. And that's scary for a CR2. What makes matters worse is that once that happens, the intellect devourer can even steal the person's body. It can go up to a incapacitated humanoid, which is what happens if it's stunned, but it could also, of course, be incapacitated in other ways. And you roll an intelligence contest with it. And if it wins, the intellect devourer consumes the target's brain, teleports into the skull, and takes control of the body. And the only ways to get it out are killing the host body, casting protection from evil and good, or restoring the devoured brain with a wish spell. And unless you can restore the brain by, I guess, taking it from the inside of the intellect devourer, the host body will die within a single round, even after having the intellect devourer shunted out of it. So this is just an absolutely terrifying creature. And honestly, not something I'd throw at a party at lower levels. Despite being a CR2, there's too much of a chance for just a couple of rolls to go badly for the party, and all of a sudden, half of them are down in an unconscious stupor. But they are great to use in stories because, for one, they are so creepy. What a fascinating concept of a creature that eats intellect, that feeds off of brainwaves. You can use them related to mind flayer encounters, of course, both as servants and perhaps as maybe even the first clue that a party gets that a mind flayer colony is close, perhaps as encountering an intellect devourer or two. You can just use them as horror monsters. Perhaps a villain or a lich or somebody that is an evil magic user has gotten one as a pet and set it loose on a town. And the players have to investigate why all these people are showing up catatonic and what exactly is happening in this particular city. The idea of the intellect devourer actually taking control of a person's body could be relevant too. The party could lose an NPC by the NPC having their brain sucked out, and all of a sudden they've discovered that this NPC that they've trusted for so long is now a Cylon, essentially. They would make a really good mystery creature in that respect as well, where perhaps the party gets clued in on something has taken over somebody in this town, and now they have to figure out who it is, who's the imposter. Because whenever they snatch a body, they actually learn everything that the previous mind knew. So there's lots of different really interesting ways to use this terrifying creature. But I think I've had enough of thinking about something devouring me. Let's go back to thinking about us devouring some food and get over to the tavern and grab some refreshment. All right, we're out here in the tavern. Today, what would you do if food was poisoned? Now, this is an interesting plot hooks for DMs to use. I'm sure it comes up more often in other TTRPGs, but in Dungeons & Dragons, it doesn't seem to come up much with the way that poison usually works in D&D. Generally, you're just going to take some amount of poison damage, or have something that imparts the poison condition to you. And that's generally not something you put in food, because especially at higher levels, that's not enough to actually kill somebody. Poison is just something you coat a weapon with, so to speak. When I think of poisoning food in Dungeons & Dragons, I think of putting some sort of substance on it that makes the party go to sleep or become incapacitated or otherwise affected by the particular food other than straight poison damage. And because this whole realm is so open-ended, you can make any effect happen if the party eats a food unsuspectingly. There's a plethora of different options for what you could actually do. You could have it be some sort of ice effect, where as the party eats, they start feeling cold on the inside, and then ice shards begin to come out of their midsection, and they begin to freeze into a block of ice, and then they wake up later in a prison. But however you want to do it, this can be a really interesting plot hook. You can have an NPC that the party is interacting with poison the food of the party. Maybe that's the introduction into the big bad evil guy of the campaign. Perhaps it's a betrayal scenario. It could also be the case that somebody poisoned the NPC that is feeding the party, and the party itself is perhaps caught in the crossfire, so to speak, of this attempted assassination. There's also different ways you could handle the aftermath. The players could just wake up and the NPC be gone, and it was used as an escape mechanism and nothing bad actually happened to the party. They were just incapacitated for a while. You could have the party end up in jail or in some sort of secret dungeon. Perhaps someone who views themselves as a good individual actually did it and brought the party to an undisclosed location so that they could meet with the party, but the party wouldn't actually know where they were. Again, this isn't something which is often used in D&D because when we think of D&D poison, it's typically just a certain amount of poison damage. But there's lots of different things you could do if you decide to poison the party's food. But I think that's about going to wrap up this week's episode of Plot Hooks. Thank you all very much for listening. Be sure to check out our Patreon as well as Plot Hooks Adventures and our Quest for 1K. Be sure to rate the podcast wherever you're listening. And of course, thanks for listening. From me, Samuel, and the rest of the Plot Hooks team, Steve, Dave, Zach, Matt, Mike, Becca, and of course, podcast pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.